We have team coverage on each of these topics, but we begin with 17's Olivia Lavoie and the allegations of corruption inside BPD's narcotics squad detailed in these Damacio Diaz documents. She's live outside BPD headquarters in downtown Bakersfield to begin our coverage. Olivia?
Tammy, when Damacio Diaz pleaded guilty to police corruption charges in May, his attorney said that corruption within the Bakersfield Police Department spread much further than just Diaz and his partner. But we never heard how. We never heard examples of allegations until now. In a stack of documents filed in federal court, Damacio Diaz describes how BPD narcotic detectives would help drug dealers sell drugs, would lie on reports, misappropriate cash, and routinely drink on the job. He says some of that was routine within the narcotics unit. Now, again, everything you're about to hear is in Damacio Diaz's own words. In an interview with the psychologist, Damacio Diaz says, "When I transferred to narcotics, I lost my way and got sucked into this underworld of deceit and wrongdoing. And as a narcotics detective who worked undercover and constantly interacted with informants and drug dealers, I became accustomed to living a double life." Diaz says his boss's expectations were incredibly high and says they would tell me they didn't care what I had to do so long as I kept bringing in these types of cases. He says, quote, "My partner and I were given so much rope that eventually we hung ourselves. We started out doing small things like cutting corners, bending the rules, fudging on paperwork and informant payment receipts, and that eventually led to not booking narcotics." And in this letter to Assistant Police Chief Lyle Martin, Diaz says he would check drugs out of the department's evidence room and replace them with fake drugs. Now, we know Diaz was caught stealing drugs and selling them. He's pled guilty to those charges in federal court. But in this same letter, he admits to doing illegal and corrupt things that he's never been publicly accused of before, like these explosive allegations of drinking on the job. Diaz describes detectives loading up on booze before beginning to follow a target, and goes on to say every time detectives were involved in assisting the sheriff's department with marijuana cultivation operations, we would load up an ice chest full of alcoholic beverages and consume during the operation. And in that recorded interview with the psychologist, Diaz talks about how he began to heavily drink while working in narcotics because he was often invited out to drink by the DEA boss and his BPD sergeant. He says one of his bosses was an alcoholic who drank on duty all the time and, quote, "I was often tasked with driving him home." He says, "One night after dropping my boss off at his home, I was pulled over by a marked police unit from our department. That patrol officer and his partner immediately recognized how intoxicated I was and joked about it with me." He goes on to say the officers drove him home, but he faced no penalties for what happened. But it gets more serious. Diaz says his drinking impacted his job and he neglected doing paperwork and reports for work. He says, quote, "When I finally got around to doing them, had forgotten important details and had to guess." He goes on to say, "My boss would sometimes ask me to write police reports for my partner because he was too drunk to remember all the details." And when it comes to handling police informants, Diaz describes a system with rules that were rarely followed, and not just by him. He describes meeting with informants alone and paying them alone. Both those actions are against BPD policy. And in an effort to have detectives follow those rules, 2 detectives have to sign off on forms documenting these meetings and transactions. But Diaz says that wasn't an obstacle because they'd cover for each other. He says, quote, "Because we were all friends and worked together, we often backed each other up and signed each other's forms." Diaz goes on to say sometimes informants were paid in drugs and some informants weren't registered as official informants to prevent any type of paper trail. And those informants were paid in forms of favors from the detective, protection from other officers or agencies, or monetary payments off the book. And for the first time since his arrest, Diaz's wife talks about how she was affected by his corruption. In a recorded interview with the psychologist, Courtney Diaz says everything changed when Diaz was transferred to Vice and Narcotics. And, quote, "I never really quite knew what he was doing during those long hours. And he had become a completely different man than the man I married." She says once Diaz was transferred back to the homicide unit, he became the man she fell in love with again, and their family was repaired.
She says while working undercover, he was a lost soul living in the dark. He has rekindled his relationship with God and found the light again. This all happened long before any charges were brought against him. I guess what I'm trying to say is he has changed. We are a united couple again who just want to raise our children.
Diaz also said in those documents that he takes sole responsibility for his actions and that he's not trying to bring down anyone else from BPD. He says he simply hopes that his experiences can prevent any other officers from going down the same road. Reporting live in downtown Bakersfield, I'm Olivia Lavoie, 17 News.